Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. New York City has been struggling with the huge and tragic problem of homelessness for many years, and yet it seems only to get worse. The latest high-profile public official to try her hand at solving this problem is our guest, Christine Quinn, former Speaker of the City Council and former mayoral candidate. She has recently been named the president of WIN, which stands for Women in Need, one of the city's largest homeless services programs for women and children. Chris, welcome. Thank you so much for coming in. I really appreciate it. So let's start by explaining what WIN is and what it does.
So WIN, we're the largest provider of shelter and permanent housing to homeless families in New York City. We have 11 shelters in 4 boroughs. On any given night, we house about 4,700 people, 2,700 of whom are children. We also right now have about 300 units of permanent housing, but we are in the process of building 160 more in Brooklyn and 30 more in the Bronx, and we want to expand that because obviously permanent housing with services, what we call supportive housing, is part of the answer to the problem. But one of the things that's significant about WIN is that it's not, as my father would say, just 3 hots and a cot. That's not going to break the cycle of homelessness. At WIN, we have what we call the way to win. It's a holistic model of services that is individualized for every family who stays with us. And I mention that, Bob, because no matter how generous government becomes on the issue of homelessness, the truth is there's always going to be a gap between what government gives us and what you actually need to have services that deal with domestic violence, mental health, substance abuse, job needs, and the special needs of children. And that's why part of the answer here is public-private partnership and companies and affluent individuals coming forward and supporting groups like WIN in addition to more government resources so we can have real programs that can break this cycle.
So you mentioned some of the challenges that homeless individuals and families face. Let's try and break this problem down so it's at least somewhat understandable. It seems to me there's been a problem with homelessness since as far back as I can remember.
Always.
My days at the Daily News,
right.
I guess back in the 70s and 80s. Why has it been so intractable and why is it so huge?
Well, I mean, partially why it's so problematic right now is if you compare New York to the days when you were back at the Daily News, there are a lot more neighborhoods that are gentrified, which means rents have gone up. There are far fewer rent-controlled or rent-stabilized apartments than there used to be. That eliminates housing stock. Now, you may say, well, is a homeless person really going to move into a rent-stabilized apartment? Maybe, maybe not. But that limits the apartments that are there for middle-class people, which then puts up them in competition, if you will, for homeless folks. On the days of SROs or even residency hotels are kind of gone in a real estate perspective in New York. So the problem has gotten worse because, in my opinion, the diversity of housing stock has gotten more narrow, and the resources that are out there for people to live in are less. You add to that, fill in the blank what the drug crisis is of any period of years, that's made things a lot harder, and we're seeing now with this synthetic marijuana and whatnot, always new, cheaper drugs out there, that adds a problem. We've also historically, over the past few decades, seen a real change in our how we're helping or not helping mentally ill people. We see that within the homeless population. And also, the housing there is in New York is extremely expensive. So I bet most viewers don't realize this fact I'm going to tell you now. Very significant number of homeless people are working. 40% of the single moms at WIN are working, but can't afford the rent. So all of that is a very serious long-term situation that's only really gotten worse over the decades. But That is the reality. Our job now is to move forward and make sure we break that cycle so it just doesn't continue. What we don't want is to assume that this level of homelessness is a given in New York City. We can't accept that for anybody, but particularly for children. 20% of the homeless people in New York, 20% are under 5 years of age.
Isn't that something?
I mean, when you have apartments selling for $50 million, we simply cannot have that in a city and 20% of homeless people be 5 years old or younger. And I know we can fix that.
Talk a little bit about, because you're talking about families and you're talking about youngsters.
Yep.
Talk a little bit about what their daily lives are like. So a family with children who are homeless, what's it like morning to night?
You know, it's different for different families. So let's take a family at Wynn that doesn't have school-age children. One of the great things we do at Wynn, and not every service provider is able to do this because of resources, is we have quality child care on site. So every child at our facility, if their mom or their parent needs to go for a job interview, needs to go for drug counseling, they can be in child care. As their children get a little older, we have after-school programs at different grade levels. During school break and the summer, we have a camp, and our camp is based on a STEM curriculum. Now, hopefully during the day, the moms, 10% of our clients are men, but it's mostly women. The parents are doing whatever they individually need to do, which could mean they're going to work. They could be going to counseling. They could be going to drug treatment. They could be in what we call income building. We don't call it job training, helping them figure out how to move up.
Why do we not call it job training?
Because when 40% of the people are working, if you call it job training, we're assuming, because you're living at a Wynn facility, you don't have a job. We want to affirm that our belief that you could have a job and that you will have a job. And we want to recognize that you probably, if 40% of people do, you have an income. We want to help you build it. And we also just kind of want to be more positive, more motivational, that we believe you can do it. It's a little off topic, but I just want to mention it. You know, we recently had an event at one of our shelters done by the Knicks and Madison Square Garden. Mm-hmm. And I mention this because how you think about things and inspiring people and how you work matters. The Knicks brought as gifts, yes, Knicks t-shirts, yes, some blankets, but they brought huge gym bags on wheels for each of the residents at the party. And I said, well, that's a nice bag. And the guy said, yes, we wanted to give them luggage so they knew we believe they're leaving.
Oh my goodness.
And that matters in how you run facilities.
I think that's great.
Yeah, and how you talk to people. We need to believe they're going to get out of this shelter. So now we were talking about the day in the life of a homeless family. So I talked a little bit about if you have non-school age children. Right. If you have school age children, it can become a lot more complicated for families because the children may not be going to school near their shelter. Right. They may have chosen to stay in the school where they lived before, which is their choice. So you can often have really long commutes. Or on Staten Island, I mentioned we don't have a shelter. I met a family last week at a Brooklyn facility in East New York. She's about an hour and a half a day, the girl, back to her high school in Staten Island.
Wow.
So that's an issue that really does become a problem. But we want to make sure at Wynn, and we really need to bake this into all shelters with children, that we have after-school program, weekend program, summer programming that's, yes, fun, but really educationally based. Because obviously the likelihood you're going to be a homeless adult is made much greater if you're a homeless child.
You mentioned the folks who have mental disabilities, drug abuse can be a problem, alcoholism, and that sort of thing. If you go all the way back to the days of deinstitutionalization, when people talked about, folks being dumped out and that sort of thing, the people that we see on the streets now, does that have any relation to those old days of deinstitutionalization?
I really think it does. And it was a little bit of what I was referencing in the beginning. And that's not to say the institutions were better.
Right. There were like gross,
horrible
abuses
places
going on, sure.
But what we did in response wasn't necessarily the best answer in all cases either. And I think there's a couple of important lessons for us to learn there. When things aren't going right in how we're treating other human beings, we need to replace them with things that are correct. And if we don't the first go round, we need to admit it and fix it. 2, we need to recognize that not seeing a problem doesn't mean there isn't a problem. We didn't necessarily see the people when they were institutionalized, but they exist. We see it now on the street. We may not have seen as many homeless people on the street when, Giuliani was mayor or whatever, but it doesn't mean they didn't exist. Right. We just didn't see them, and we can't confuse that as a solution to the problem. Now, the reality is that mental health challenges are huge in any city, right. But particularly significant within our homeless population, and that's understandable. And that's why one of the things we have to make sure is included in our homeless service work is mental health work. But we have to learn a lesson too from how things went with deinstitutionalization, which is that if we push people out without supports and a plan, it won't work. One of the things I hear from the staff at WIN all the time is that the Department of Homeless Services is pushing to get people out of shelter. You know what happens when you push somebody out of shelter, even if it's into a permanent apartment before they're ready or back to their sister's couch, they end up back in shelter. And think of how dreadful it must be to appear at intake with your child when you're homeless. Think of it the second time. We cannot push people out of shelter before they're ready just to meet some goals that we've set for ourselves arbitrarily. We need to recognize that often people need the assistance of comprehensive holistic shelter until their lives are stabilized. Then they should move to permanent housing, and when they need to, that permanent housing should include services for them. That's a good way to be dealing with the system and recognizing that some people just need a little bit more help.
So how prepared is WIN to deal with homeless individuals, part of families, who have mental health challenges or who are drug addicted or have alcohol problems with alcohol?
We have services in all of those areas, but it is absolutely an area where we are looking to expand. Now,
so you want to do more in those areas?
We want to do more in those areas, but one thing I feel really strongly about is not every nonprofit needs to be everything.
Right.
So that doesn't mean WIN needs to become the best drug counseling program in the world. No, we need to partner with those groups, bring those groups into our shelters to have more of their counselors, their services on site. We need to partner more with folks who can do alcoholism treatment, and we're in those conversations right now about how we expand those services, because it's really helpful to reduce the amount of time people have to go somewhere else, because they already have so much traveling to do with job interviews and checking in, with social services, et cetera. So we want to bring as many of those resources into the shelters. The other thing we're working on doing is creating a trauma-based intervention program for children, having psychiatrists and psychologists on site who treat homelessness and being the child of a domestic violence survivor as a trauma, the way we now treat that kind of trauma with veterans or other people who've experienced it. Because if you don't address it for that child, it will resurface.
Now, we've seen this problem increase from mayor to mayor to mayor. So there was Giuliani, and Bloomberg came in, and Bloomberg presumably was addressing the homeless problem with quite a bit of resources, and yet the numbers in the shelters at least increased under Bloomberg, and they have increased more under de Blasio. If mayors are focused on this issue, why does it keep increasing?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to not over-focus on the number of people in shelters as the only factor that determines whether we are successful or not. Because again, some people, based on what's going on in their lives, may need time in a shelter to stabilize what's going on for themselves. So that's not the be-all and end-all of the definition, in my opinion. I think the challenge, though, overall with homelessness under Bloomberg and now de Blasio, and you can't argue the facts, it's gotten worse,
Right.
it has gotten worse, is really a result of the loss of affordable and quality housing stock. I think if one did some kind of study, you could go back to the reductions in rent protections in the early 2000s, I guess it was late 90s, do a chart of that and a chart of homelessness, and I think you would see a clear connection. The gentrification of neighborhoods, you can see a clear connection. I mean, I live in Chelsea. You used to be able to have a lot of people paying decent rents in rent-protected apartments in Chelsea. You don't really see that at all anymore. And how does that play out in the reality of Wynn? One of the things we want to do is build more and run more supportive housing. It's hard to find the real estate and the buildings to do that in, which we can afford as a not-for-profit. We're very stable, so we're probably going to be able to do that, but it's not as easy as one might think, or it was, say, when Ed Koch was mayor, and you had all of those abandoned properties.
So does this mean that if you've got a mayoral administration that's working on development, the idea is it's a capitalist society, people want to make money, presumably they would say that it creates jobs or whatever.
And
so you're working on development on the one hand, and you're working on the homeless problem on the other hand. Are those two problems fighting each other to the extent that you succeed more and more with development, you're going to drive people into homelessness?
Not necessarily at all. And I think there are absolutely ways to be doing development that could be benefiting the homeless. There is no reason why, there can't be partnerships between developers and not-for-profits that want to do housing. There isn't any reason why we can't build into the model of housing that are getting built units that are affordable to working homeless people. But critical to this, I really do believe, is finding a way to get Albany, and this may sound like a pipe dream, to make the rent law stronger, because that really is a very important part of this. And critical to this is holding landlords accountable who are letting their properties deteriorate because they think they're going to be the next hot neighborhood. Right. That's an enormous problem.
What's the truth about these tax breaks that developers have been getting for many years now? Homeless advocates are saying that we're giving tax breaks to develop luxury housing, and they're not really coming through with affordable apartments, et cetera. Is there a way to explain this?
The idea of those were, and they were kind of in somewhat of a different time, that there were neighborhoods that needed an incentive to be developed. The truth is there's probably far fewer of those neighborhoods now than there were when these tax breaks were, for better or worse, created. I mean, it's very hard to think of neighborhoods now that need an incentive to be developed at this point in time. And one of the things we have to be thinking about when we do a housing plan is often in those kind of developments, there's a prioritizing of middle-class units as the ones that are affordable, which, don't get me wrong, we need, but we need to be thinking about making sure we're finding ways to get units of across-the-board affordability.
But did we waste a lot of money on tax breaks that went to housing that in neighborhoods that would have been developed anyway?
I can't answer that question. I mean, that really is a question that needs an analysis to see. I hope not. You know what I mean? I really hope not. There's no question that at some places, yes, right? There's no question. So wholesale, I hope not. But there's definitely no question. Like when I was working for Tom Duane in the 90s, there was still tax breaks in the northern part of our district, like the Hell's Kitchen area, where you did not need. It was clear, and Tom and others pushed to get rid of those. But the other ones that kept going, I hope not. But, the data will answer that question when we see what gets developed. Look, the problem is complicated. And
it's very complicated.
And there's not an easy answer. Because if there was an easy answer, somebody would have done it already. Right. But one of the things that we need to be mindful of is not allowing the complexity of the housing debate and the homeless debate to be driven by the cover of newspapers, with all due respect to newspapers. And we cannot allow it to become an us versus them scenario. That's not going to solve the problem. All that's going to do is rip us apart. Now, does solving this problem mean that some people are going to have to sacrifice, that developers might get less tax breaks? Yes. That neighborhoods may get supportive housing or a shelter that they don't want? Yes. But that's part of what we've always done as New Yorkers, is come together to fix things. And if you don't get the right to complain about the person on your corner, unless you're going to step forward and find a way to be helpful. And I really think that's what New Yorkers want to do. I got to tell you, at WIN, we have almost 500 volunteers and people calling all the time. We have a woman who makes hundreds of stockings filled with treats and brings them to our shelter. She just makes them around her kitchen table, which is probably this big because she lives in Manhattan. So we can do it. We just have to stop allowing the debate to be driven by finger pointing.
Now, the homeless population, the shelter population every night is somewhere between 50 and 60,000 people,
Right.
which is a tremendous number.
It is.
23 or 24,000 of them are children.
Yep.
But that actually understates the problem, doesn't
Correct.
it? Because you have families who are doubled up and tripled up. Talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely. I mean, the numbers, obviously the numbers in the shelters don't reflect the numbers on the street. And you don't really see families on the street, among other, thank God, but among other reasons, it's actually a crime to have your child on the street. So you don't see that. So most of those families are living on their cousin's couch or their, sister's couch or whatever. And that's not sustainable for the long term for a host of reasons. And actually what we see in our data is that the families who leave our shelter and go back to what we call family reunification, go back to their family, are most likely to come back into shelter because it didn't work and it's not going to work again. The other thing I worry about with pushing people back into families is, do we really know beyond a shadow of a doubt that we're not inadvertently pushing back somebody into an abusive situation? Right. Because, Bob, one of the things I think we all think is that domestic violence and homelessness happens like it does on Law and Order. You know what I mean? That somebody beats you up, you call 911. That's not how it happens in most cases. 35 to 40% of the women at WIN are survivors of domestic violence. But single digits present to us that way.
That's a tremendous percentage.
Huge. And I bet most providers who have women and family would say the same thing, but they don't come in and say that. Why? They don't necessarily trust us off the bat to say it. They've said it before and nobody helped them, or they don't even know that it's something worth saying. And that's important for us to know on a host of levels, but not least of which we need to rework how we're handling the homeless who are domestic violence survivors, because most aren't calling 911. So we need to get some regulatory changes and other things that make it easier for domestic violence survivors to get the support they need.
I have more questions, but we've run out of time. Oh my goodness, frustrating. I hope we can have you back.
Yes.
Thank you so much for doing this with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. Donald Trump's presidential campaign is an obscenity writ large across America. His gross personal attacks, his infantile mocking of a disabled reporter, his disgusting comments about women, all of it should make decent people cringe. His lies are horrendous. Mexican immigrants are criminals, rapists. Most white people who are murdered in America are killed by blacks. He saw thousands and thousands of Muslims in New Jersey cheering the attacks on the World Trade Center. All false. Whenever I listen to Trump for more than a few minutes, I feel like taking a shower. But it's Trump's approach to America's very serious problems and his bizarre proposals and solutions that raised the level of his campaign from the merely contemptible to the truly obscene. When he said he would build a wall to keep Mexicans out, he was just getting started. He has since proposed registering American Muslims and the establishment of a national database and watch list to keep track of them. His latest atrocious proposal would bar all Muslims from entering the United States, even American citizens who had left, say, on vacation. They would not be allowed back in. Trump has tried to walk that proposal back a bit, but only after he was hit with torrents of criticism. I think we're not taking Donald Trump seriously enough. His exploitation of the very real fears of ordinary people and his relentless targeting of specific religious and ethnic groups for blame, along with his promises to bring those groups to heel, it's all the very stuff of fascism. Those who truly love this country should not want to take even the smallest steps down that terrible road. That's all for now. See you next time.